Sometimes the heaviest burden a man can carry isn't what he's lost, but what he's done to others. For 20 years, wealthy rancher Jedediah Cole has lived with the guilt of stealing another man's land, and now that guilt has driven him to post a $1,000 reward for any woman willing to marry him sight unseen. When a mysterious veiled bride steps off the stagecoach in Glory Bend, the whole town gathers to witness what they think will be the strangest wedding in territory history. But when that veil lifts, Jed's face goes white with recognition. Standing before him is the daughter of Thomas Whitmore, the very man whose land he helped steal decades ago. She hasn't come for his money or revenge. She's come offering something far more precious and dangerous, a chance at redemption for them both. What could drive a woman to marry the man who destroyed her father? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Glory Bend, Montana Territory, as it had for the past 40 years since the town first sprouted from the prairie like a stubborn weed. The wooden buildings stood weathered but proud, their false fronts reaching toward a sky so vast it made a man feel both infinite and insignificant all at once. This was a place where time moved at the pace of seasons, where a man's word still meant something, and where secrets had a way of festering in the high mountain air until they either poisoned a soul or set it free. Jedediah Cole stood on the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house, watching the distant mountains catch the first golden light of dawn. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around eyes the color of winter sky. His hands, wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, bore the calluses of honest work, though folks in town knew his wealth came from more than just cattle and sweat. Some fortunes, he'd learned the hard way, came with a price that compound interest couldn't calculate. The Cole Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see in 3 directions, encompassing nearly 30,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. Whitmore's Creek ran clear and cold through the heart of it, fed by snowmelt from the distant peaks. The irony of that name wasn't lost on Jed. Hadn't been for 20 years. Every time he heard the water rushing over stone, it whispered Thomas Whitmore's name like a prayer for the dead. Behind him, the house stood as a monument to prosperity built on shifting sand. 3 stories of solid timber and Colorado sandstone, with 12 rooms that echoed too often with the sound of one man's footsteps. His late wife, Sarah, had filled these rooms with laughter once, before the fever took her 5 years back. Now, they felt more like a mausoleum than a home, each piece of furniture a reminder of conversations that would never come again. "Mr. Cole?" The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, his ranch foreman for the past 15 years. Miguel had the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life under an unforgiving sun, but his dark eyes held a kindness that Jed had come to treasure. "The boys are asking about moving the cattle to the north pasture. That grass is coming in real fine." Jed nodded, though his mind remained fixed on the mountains. "Tell them to wait another week. I want to see how this weather holds." He paused, then added more quietly, "Miguel, you remember Thomas Whitmore?" Miguel's face grew still. In all their years together, Jed had never spoken that name aloud. "See, I remember. Good man. Had a spread about 10 miles north of here before—" He stopped himself. "Before I helped steal it from him." The words came out flat, a matter of fact, like stating the price of grain. "You never asked me about that night." "Wasn't my place to ask, patron, but I saw what it did to you, still doing to you." Jed turned to face his foreman, this man who'd become more friend than employee over the years. "He had a daughter, Clara. She would be—" He calculated quickly. 28 now, if she's still alive. Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You thinking about her?" "I think about her every day." Jed set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. 20 years ago, when her father died, she just disappeared, vanished like smoke. I tried to find her, Miguel, hired men to search. Nothing. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe she did, and I was too much of a coward to look hard enough. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a bell, the stagecoach horn echoing across the valley. Both men turned toward the road that wound down from the mountain pass. In Glory Bend, the weekly stagecoach was an event that drew half the town, bringing news from the outside world and occasionally depositing strangers who would either quickly move on or put down roots in the unforgiving soil. "You expecting anyone?" Miguel asked. Jed's jaw tightened. Maybe. The truth was, he'd been expecting someone for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd posted that damn notice. It had seemed like a good idea when the loneliness became too heavy to bear, a straightforward business proposition that might bring companionship to his empty house, without the complications of courtship or the vulnerability of admitting his desperate need for human connection. The notice had been simple enough. Successful rancher seeks bride, $1,000 upon marriage, must be willing to wed sight unseen, wearing veil until vows are complete. Write to J. Cole, Glory Bend, Montana Territory. He'd posted it in newspapers across 3 territories, then immediately regretted the impulse. What kind of woman would answer such an advertisement? What kind of man would make such an offer? The kind of man who'd spent 20 years trying to buy his way out of hell, apparently. Down in Glory Bend, the stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of Hartwell's General Store in a cloud of dust and creaking leather. Jed could see the small crowd gathering: shopkeeper Ezra Hartwell, Dr. Benjamin Morrison, and probably half a dozen others drawn by curiosity like moths to flame. From his vantage point on the ridge, he watched a figure step down from the coach. A woman in traveling clothes, carrying herself with a dignity that was visible even at a distance. "That her?" Miguel asked quietly. "I don't know." But something in Jed's chest tightened like a fist around his heart. "Miguel, have the boys saddle Ranger. I think I need to go to town." "See, Patron, you want me to come with you?" Jed considered this. Miguel had been his anchor through Sarah's death, his steadying presence during the worst of the grief. But this, whatever this was, felt like something he needed to face alone. "No, but thank you." An hour later, Jed rode Ranger down the familiar path to Glory Bend, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. The woman, if she was indeed responding to his advertisement, would be waiting at the church by now. Reverend Matthews had agreed to perform the ceremony, though not without expressing his concerns about the unusual arrangement. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, Jedediah," the Reverend had said, "not a business transaction." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Jed had replied, though he'd known even then it was the wrong answer. The town seemed unusually quiet as he rode down Main Street. A few faces peered out from windows, and he caught sight of Mrs. Henderson whispering urgently to Mrs. Caldwell behind the bakery. Word traveled fast in a place like Glory Bend, and his advertisement had been the subject of considerable speculation for weeks. He tied Ranger to the hitching post outside the white-painted church and stood for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the windows, he could see movement inside. Figures preparing for what might be the strangest wedding ceremony in the territory's history. The church door opened, and Reverend Matthews emerged, his usually jovial face creased with concern. "Jedediah, she's here, but I have to tell you, is she willing to go through with it?" "She is, but there's something about her, something familiar. I can't quite place it." The Reverend studied Jed's face carefully. "Are you certain about this arrangement?" Jed thought about the empty rooms in his house, the silence that had become his constant companion, the weight of guilt that had grown heavier with each passing year. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Inside the church, the afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the wooden pews. At the altar stood a woman in ivory silk, her face hidden beneath a veil of fine lace that fell to her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, hands folded in front of her, and something about her posture spoke of both strength and sorrow. Jed walked slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing in the hushed space. As he drew closer, he noticed details that made his breath catch. The graceful line of her neck, the way she held her head, the familiar curve of her shoulders. But it was impossible. After 20 years, after all his searching, she couldn't simply walk into his life in response to a desperate advertisement. Could she? He took his place beside her at the altar, close enough now to smell the faint scent of lavender water and to see the slight tremor in her hands. Reverend Matthews opened his Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, his voice carrying a weight of uncertainty that had never been there before. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words washed over Jed like a river he couldn't cross. All he could think about was the woman beside him, the secret hidden beneath the veil, and the reckoning that had been 20 years in the coming. "Do you, Jedediah Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jed felt his throat constrict as he stared at the veiled figure beside him. Through the lace, he could make out the shadow of her profile, but nothing more. 20 years of wondering, 20 years of guilt, and it all came down to this moment, a leap of faith built on desperation and a $1,000 gamble. "I do," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Reverend Matthews turned to the woman. "Do you—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. In all the arrangements, that detail had somehow been overlooked. "Do you take Jedediah Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. Something cultured, educated, not what he'd expected from a woman desperate enough to answer his advertisement. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The Reverend's voice carried a note of reluctance, as if he still hoped someone would speak up and stop this peculiar ceremony. "Jedediah, you may kiss your bride." This was the moment when everything would be revealed, when the veil would lift and he would discover what kind of woman had answered his desperate call. Jed's hands shook as he reached for the delicate lace, his fingers brushing against fabric that seemed too fine for frontier life. The veil lifted slowly, like morning mist rising from a valley, and Jed's world tilted on its axis. The face that emerged was older than he remembered, marked by years and hardship, but unmistakable. High cheekbones, dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon, and eyes the color of deep forest shadows. Eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades, eyes that belonged to Clara Whitmore. The church seemed to spin around him, his vision narrowed to just her face, and suddenly he was 20 years younger, standing in Thomas Whitmore's parlor, while the man begged him to reconsider the land deal. He could see Clara then, barely 8 years old, peeking around the doorframe with those same dark eyes, watching as her world crumbled. "Hello, Jedediah," she said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of all the years between them. The small congregation behind them erupted in murmurs and whispers. Someone, Mrs. Henderson probably, let out a gasp. Reverend Matthew stepped back as if he'd witnessed something supernatural, but Jed couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The woman he'd searched for, the daughter of the man he'd wronged, stood before him as his wife. The irony was so complete, so perfectly terrible, that for a moment he wondered if he was dreaming. "You're—" he started, then stopped. The words felt inadequate, dangerous. "Clara Whitmore," she finished for him. though I suppose it's Clara Cole now. The name hit him like a physical blow. Cole. She carried his name now, the name that had taken everything from her family. The weight of it seemed to settle on his shoulders like a yoke. How? The question came out as barely a whisper. A sad smile touched the corners of her mouth. I've been watching you, Jedediah. For a very long time. I know about the men you hired to search for me. I know about the money you set aside. My father's money, really, hoping someday you could make amends. I know about the nights you ride out to his grave. Each revelation was another blow. She'd been close enough to watch him all these years, close enough to see his guilt and desperation, and he'd never known. Where? Where have you been? Denver, mostly, working as a teacher, building a life. She glanced around the church, taking in the shocked faces of the congregation. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private? Reverend Matthews cleared his throat. I suppose. I mean, the ceremony is complete. You're legally married now. He looked between them with confusion and growing concern. Though perhaps someone should explain. Thank you, Reverend, Clara said with quiet dignity. I believe my husband and I have much to discuss. My husband. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Jed thought he knew about his life. He offered her his arm with numb formality, and together they walked down the aisle while the congregation whispered and stared. Outside the church, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too ordinary for such an extraordinary moment. Clara moved to untie a carpet bag from the back of the stagecoach, her movements precise and purposeful. She'd planned this, Jed realized. Every detail had been carefully considered. The ranch, he said finally. We should go to the ranch. She nodded. I'd like that. I'd like to see what you've built on my father's land. The words were said without malice, but they cut deeper than any accusation. Jed helped her into his wagon, his hands shaking as he took the reins. The ride to the ranch passed in silence, both of them lost in thoughts too complex for words. The ranch came into view as they crested the familiar ridge, and Jed found himself seeing it through Clara's eyes. The sprawling house, the well-maintained barns, the cattle dotting the green pastures, all of it built on ground that should have been hers. All of it paid for with money that should have supported her and her father through their final years. It's beautiful, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice. He would have loved to see it like this. He always said this land could support 1,000 head of cattle if it was managed right. They pulled up in front of the house, and Miguel appeared from the barn. His eyes widened when he saw Clara, and Jed realized his foreman had recognized her too. How many others in Glory Bend would remember Thomas Whitmore's daughter? Miguel, Jed said carefully, this is my wife. Clara. Miguel removed his hat and nodded respectfully. Senora Cole, welcome home. Home. The word echoed strangely in the mountain air. This had been her home once, in a way. Her father's dream, anyway. Now it was hers by marriage to the man who'd stolen it. Inside the house, Clara moved through the rooms with quiet grace, touching nothing but observing everything. In the parlor, she stopped in front of the large window that looked out over the valley. This is where he planned to put his desk, she said softly. He wanted to watch the sun set over the mountains while he worked on his accounts. Jed's chest tightened. Clara, I need you to know, what happened to your father, the land deal? It wasn't supposed to go that way. I was young, stupid. I got caught up in something I didn't understand until it was too late. She turned to face him, and for the first time since the veil had lifted, he saw something besides sadness in her eyes. Tell me, she said. Tell me everything. I've waited 20 years to hear your side of the story. So he told her. About Harrison Caldwell, the Eastern investor who'd promised quick money for young men willing to help acquire land for the railroad. About the forged documents and the false claims. About the night her father died, alone and broken, believing he'd lost everything to legitimate legal proceedings. "I didn't know they'd forged his signature on the debt papers," Jed said, his voice growing hoarse. "I didn't know they'd claimed he owed money he never borrowed. By the time I found out the truth, he was already gone, and you'd disappeared." Clara listened in silence, her face revealing nothing. When he finished, she walked to the window again and stood looking out at the land that rolled away toward the distant mountains. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. "Why did you agree to help them, even before you knew about the forgeries?" It was the question he'd asked himself 1,000 times, the one that kept him awake in the small hours of the night. "Because I was 25 years old and thought I was smarter than I was. Because they offered me enough money to buy my own spread, and I wanted that more than I wanted to think about who might get hurt." He paused, then added more quietly, "Because I was a fool." She nodded slowly. "And now? What do you want now?" The question hung between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he was brave enough to cross. But looking at her silhouetted against the window, standing in the house that should have been her father's, Jed knew there was only one honest answer. "I want to make it right," he said. "I want to give you back what was taken, and if you'll let me, I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to be the man your father deserved to deal with 20 years ago." Clara turned from the window, and when she looked at him, something had shifted in her expression. The sadness remained, but underneath it, he glimpsed something that might have been hope. "Then we should probably start with dinner," she said practically. "I assume you have a cook, or are you expecting me to manage a household I've never seen on an empty stomach?" Despite everything, the shock, the guilt, the impossibility of the situation, Jed found himself almost smiling. "We have a cook. Mrs. Patterson comes up from town 3 times a week. But tonight I'll cook," Clara said firmly. "It's my first night in my new home. I'd like to make something for my husband." The word still sent a shock through him, but this time it carried a different weight. Not the crushing burden of irony, but something lighter, something that might, given time, grow into something real. The evening sun painted the kitchen in shades of gold and amber as Clara moved through the space with surprising familiarity. She'd found an apron hanging on a peg near the stove, Sarah's apron, Jed realized with a start, and had tied it around her waist as if she'd done so 1,000 times before. Her movements were efficient, purposeful, and watching her work sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Your wife was a good cook," Clara said without looking up from the potatoes she was peeling. "Mrs. Henderson told me, said Sarah could make a feast from whatever was in the pantry." Jed leaned against the doorframe, unsure whether to help or simply observe this strange domestic scene. "You've been talking to Mrs. Henderson?" "I've been talking to everyone." Clara's knife moved in steady, practiced strokes. Amazing how much people will tell a stranger passing through town, especially when that stranger mentions she might be settling in the area. She glanced up at him briefly. "I've known about your life for 5 years, Jedediah. Your routine, your business dealings, your late wife's garden, the way you ride out to the cemetery every Sunday after church." The casual revelation hit him like cold water. 5 years. She'd been watching him for 5 years, studying him like a specimen under glass, and he'd never known. "Why?" he asked. "Why watch me? Why not just approach me directly?" Clara set down her knife and turned to face him fully. "Because I needed to know who you'd become, the boy who helped steal my father's land. I needed to see if he'd grown into a man worth forgiving. And..." The question came out rougher than he'd intended. A small smile touched her lips. "I married you, didn't I?" Before he could respond, she'd turned back to her cooking, leaving him to wrestle with the implications. She hadn't married him for money. That much was clear. A woman who'd spent 5 years watching and planning didn't need a $1,000 reward to make her decision. She'd married him for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, and that uncertainty gnawed at him like hunger. "The meat will be ready soon," she said, checking the roast in the oven. "Could you set the table? I noticed your wife had beautiful china in the dining room." "We don't have to use the good china. Sarah only brought it out for special occasions." Clara's voice carried a gentle firmness. "This is a special occasion, Jedediah. The first dinner in our marriage. I'd like to honor that. Our marriage." The words still felt foreign, impossible. This morning he'd been a lonely widower posting advertisements for companionship. Tonight he was married to the daughter of the man he'd wronged in a union that defied every reasonable expectation. Jed went to retrieve the china, Sarah's wedding set that had been gathering dust in the dining room cabinet. The delicate blue and white pattern had been her pride, shipped all the way from Philadelphia when they'd married. Setting the table with it now felt like a betrayal and a blessing simultaneously. Sarah would have wanted the dishes to be used, to bring joy to someone's table rather than sitting forgotten in the dark. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Clara standing at the window that looked out over the back pasture. Her hands rested on the sill, and something in her posture spoke of deep thought. "That's where he planned to build the barn," she said quietly. "He drew up plans, showed them to me a dozen times. Said it would be the finest barn in the territory, with stalls for 20 horses and a hayloft big enough to hold winter feed for 1,000 head of cattle." Jed followed her gaze to where his own barn stood, not in the exact spot she indicated, but close enough to make his chest tighten. "Clara, I need you to understand something. Everything I built here, every building, every fence, it was never about erasing what your father wanted. I tried to honor his vision as much as I could." She turned to look at him, curiosity replacing the distant sadness in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Come with me." He offered her his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were warm and slightly rough from work. Not the soft hand of a lady of leisure, but the capable hands of a woman who'd made her own way in the world. They walked out onto the back porch, where the evening light was beginning to fade into purple dusk. Jed pointed toward the barn, then the fields beyond. "The barn. I built it 30 feet north of where your father wanted it, because Miguel told me the drainage was better there, but I used his design for the interior. Found his plans in the old cabin after he died." Clara's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "The fencing, the water troughs, even the way the pastures are divided. It's all based on his notes. I found them in a box with other papers, and I couldn't bring myself to ignore them. It felt like honoring the dead," she finished softly. "Like trying to build something he would have been proud of." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the cattle move slowly across the distant pasture. A hawk circled overhead, riding the evening thermals, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "He would have been proud," Clara said finally. "He would have loved seeing the land used this way, productive and well cared for." She paused, then added more quietly, "He would have hated how you came to own it, but he would have respected what you've done with it." The admission felt like absolution, and condemnation rolled into one. Jed squeezed her hand gently. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know, not a day has passed that I haven't regretted my part in what happened." "I know." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. "I've seen you at his grave, Jedediah. I've watched you pull weeds from around his headstone and leave wildflowers from the meadow. I've seen you talk to him like he could hear you." The revelation sent heat rushing up Jed's neck. Those private moments, those conversations with a dead man who couldn't forgive him, she'd witnessed them all. "You were watching me there too. Sometimes, from a distance. I needed to see how you grieved him." She looked up at him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed deeper, older. A man who's truly remorseful grieves differently than one who's just afraid of consequences. "And what did you conclude?" "That your grief was real. Complicated, but real." She released his hand and walked to the porch railing, resting her hands on the sun-weathered wood. I've had 20 years to hate you, Jedediah. 20 years to plan revenge, to imagine all the ways I could make you pay for what you took from us. Jed's stomach clenched. And did you? Plan revenge. Clara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. For the first 10 years, yes. I imagined coming back here with lawyers, with evidence, with enough power to destroy you the way you destroyed my father. I dreamed of watching you lose everything, of seeing you broken and alone. What changed? I grew up. She turned back to him, and her expression was sad but clear. I realized that destroying you wouldn't bring him back. It wouldn't give me those lost years or heal the wounds his death left behind. All it would do is make me into the kind of person he taught me not to be. The smell of dinner drifted from the kitchen. Roast beef and fresh bread, potatoes and something that smelled like apple pie. Ordinary scents of home and comfort, made extraordinary by the woman who'd prepared them and the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. We should eat, Clara said practically, and then you can show me the rest of the house. I'd like to know where I'll be sleeping tonight. The dinner passed with careful conversation and long silences, both of them navigating the strange territory of shared meals and wedding rings. Clara had prepared a feast that would have satisfied 10 men. Roast beef so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork, potatoes creamy with butter and fresh chives, and bread that filled the house with the warm scent of home. Jed found himself eating more than he had in months, as if his appetite had awakened from a long sleep. "You're a fine cook," he said, breaking a comfortable silence that had stretched between them as they finished the apple pie she'd somehow conjured from his sparse pantry. "My father taught me," Clara replied, setting down her fork with characteristic precision. "After my mother died when I was 12, he said we had 2 choices: learn to take care of ourselves, or starve with dignity. He chose to learn." "I remember your mother," Jed said carefully. "Eleanor, wasn't it? She had the most beautiful garden in the territory. Roses that bloomed twice a season." Something flickered across Clara's face. Surprise, perhaps, that he'd retained such details. She did. She could make anything grow even in the worst soil. Said it was about patience and understanding what each plant needed to thrive. "Is that where you learned about people too?" Clara studied him across the table, her dark eyes measuring. "Perhaps, though people are more complicated than roses. They can choose to resist kindness even when it would help them flourish." The observation hung between them, and Jed wondered if she was speaking about him, herself, or both of them. Before he could ask, Clara rose and began clearing the dishes with efficient movements that spoke of long practice with domestic responsibilities. "Let me help," Jed offered, standing. "You're the guest in your own house tonight," Clara said with what might have been amusement. "Tomorrow we can work out how to share the tasks, but tonight you promised to show me where I'll be sleeping." The words sent an unexpected jolt through him. In all his planning, such as it had been, he'd somehow managed to avoid thinking about the practical realities of housing a new wife. The master bedroom still held too much of Sarah's presence. Her hairbrush on the vanity, her favorite quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the faint scent of the lavender water she'd favored. "There are several guest rooms," he said carefully. "The blue room at the end of the hall has a good view of the mountains, and it's been kept aired and clean." Clara paused in her clearing, a stack of plates balanced in her hands. "Is that what you prefer? Separate rooms?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. I thought you might be more comfortable." "Jedediah." Her voice carried the same gentle firmness he'd noticed earlier. "We're married, legally and in the eyes of God. I didn't come here to play house or pretend at being your housekeeper. I came here to be your wife." The words hit him like a physical blow. "But you don't, this isn't exactly a traditional courtship. You don't know me, not really." I know you better than you think." Clara set the dishes back down and moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the lavender water she wore, different from Sarah's, but somehow familiar. "I know you read every night before bed. I've seen the lamplight in your window. I know you favor your left leg since that horse threw you 3 summers ago. I know you still set 2 places at the table sometimes before you remember you're eating alone." Each observation was another revelation of how closely she'd watched him, how completely she'd studied his life from the shadows. The thought should have unnerved him, but instead it stirred something else, a warmth he hadn't felt since Sarah died. "I know something else too," Clara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know you're afraid." "Of what?" "Of letting someone close again, of caring for someone who might be taken away, of believing you deserve happiness after what you did to my family." The accuracy of her assessment left him breathless. She'd seen through him completely, stripped away all his carefully constructed defenses with the precision of a surgeon. "Clara, I'm afraid too," she interrupted. "I'm afraid of trusting the man who helped destroy my father. I'm afraid of letting myself care for you when I've spent so many years nurturing anger instead. But fear isn't a good foundation for a marriage, Jedediah. And neither is guilt." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the worry lines that had deepened over the years. "What happened 20 years ago brought us both pain, but it also brought us here, to this moment, to this chance. We can build something new from the wreckage of the past, or we can let the ghosts keep us apart forever." Jed caught her hand in his, pressing her palm against his cheek. "I don't want to dishonor Sarah's memory." "You think loving again dishonors the dead?" Clara's voice carried gentle rebuke. "My father loved my mother until the day he died, but he also told me that the heart isn't a finite resource. Love doesn't diminish by being shared, it multiplies. And if you change your mind, if you wake up tomorrow and realize what a mistake this was." Clara smiled, and for the first time since he'd lifted her veil, he saw genuine warmth in her expression. "Then I suppose we'll deal with that tomorrow. But tonight, I'd like to see our bedroom. I'd like to put my things next to yours and sleep beside the man who's been carrying my father's ghost for 20 years. The word "our" settled over him like a blessing he didn't deserve, but desperately wanted to accept. Jed led her upstairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage. The master bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and he pushed it open with trembling fingers. Sarah's presence seemed to fill the room, her bottles and brushes on the vanity, her favorite shawl draped over the rocking chair by the window, her books still stacked on the bedside table. Jed felt Clara's stillness beside him and turned to see her taking it all in with quiet understanding. "She's still here," Clara observed without judgment. I didn't know how to put it all away. It felt like erasing her." Clara walked to the vanity and picked up Sarah's silver hairbrush, running her thumb over the elaborate handle. "She wouldn't want to be erased, but she also wouldn't want to keep you prisoner." She set the brush down carefully. "Tomorrow we can pack her things properly, with love and respect. Keep what brings you comfort and store the rest safely." "We?" "I'd like to know her through her belongings, if you're willing to share the stories. She was part of your life, which means she's part of our history now too." The generosity of the gesture overwhelmed him. Here was a woman who had every right to hate him, offering to help him honor his dead wife's memory. It was more than he'd dared hope for, more than he deserved. "Tomorrow," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Clara nodded and began unpinning her hair, the dark strands falling around her shoulders as she moved with unself-conscious grace. "Tomorrow we start building something new. Tonight we simply begin." 3 weeks into their marriage, Jed woke to the sound of Clara humming in the kitchen below. The melody drifted up through the floorboards, something soft and melancholy that he didn't recognize, but that seemed to fit the morning mist rolling across the valley. Sarah had never been one for singing, preferring the quiet contemplation of her morning coffee, but Clara filled the house with small sounds that made it feel alive again. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, pausing at the kitchen doorway to watch his wife work. She stood at the stove, her dark hair pinned up in a practical bun, wearing one of the simple calico dresses she'd brought in her single carpet bag. The sight of her moving through his kitchen with such natural grace still caught him off guard sometimes, as if his mind couldn't quite accept that this wasn't all an elaborate dream. "Morning," he said, and she turned with a smile that had grown warmer over the past weeks. "Coffee's ready, and breakfast will be soon. Miguel stopped by earlier. Said there's trouble with the fence line up near Miller's Creek." Jed accepted the coffee she offered, noting how she'd learned exactly how he liked it, black and strong enough to wake the dead. "What kind of trouble?" "Cut wire, from what he could tell. Clean cuts, not wear or weather." Clara's expression grew serious. "He thinks someone's been driving cattle through during the night." The news settled in his stomach like a stone. Cattle rustling wasn't uncommon in the territory, but the Cole ranch had been largely left alone, partly due to its reputation and partly because Jed maintained good relationships with his neighbors. "Did he see any sign of which direction they headed?" "North, toward the border. He's waiting for you by the barn." Jed drained his coffee and reached for his hat, then paused. 3 weeks ago, he would have simply kissed Sarah goodbye and headed out to deal with ranch business. But Clara wasn't Sarah, and their relationship existed in strange territory he was still learning to navigate. "I might be gone most of the day," he said carefully. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and moved closer. Without hesitation, she straightened his collar and brushed a piece of lint from his shoulder, small, wifely gestures that sent unexpected warmth through his chest. "Be careful. And take extra men if Miguel thinks you should." She rose on her toes and pressed a light kiss to his cheek, the contact brief but meaningful. It wasn't passion, not yet, but it was affection, real and growing. When she pulled back, Jed found himself reluctant to leave. "Clara," he started, then stopped, unsure how to voice the thoughts that had been growing stronger each day, the way she'd fit into his life. How natural it felt to come home to her presence. How the guilt that had plagued him for 20 years seemed lighter when she was near. "Go," she said with gentle firmness. "We'll have time to talk tonight." Outside, Miguel waited with 2 other hands, Pete Hawkins and young Tommy Brennan, both solid men who'd been with the ranch for years. Miguel's expression was grim as he handed Jed the reins to his horse. "It's bad, patron. Looks like maybe 50 head taken, all from the north pasture. The cuts were clean. Someone who knew what they were doing." They rode out in the cool morning air, the horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the packed earth. As they approached the damaged fence line, Jed could see Miguel had been right. The wire hadn't broken from stress or weather. It had been deliberately cut in 3 places, creating a wide gap that cattle could be driven through easily. "Professional job," Pete observed, dismounting to examine the cuts more closely. This wasn't some drifters looking for easy money. This was planned. Jed studied the tracks in the soft earth beyond the fence. Multiple horses, maybe 6 or 7 riders, and the churned ground where cattle had been bunched and driven north. The trail was clear enough to follow, at least for now. "Tommy, ride back to the house and tell Mrs. Cole what we found. Ask her to send word to Sheriff Morrison in town. We'll want him to know about this." Jed turned to Miguel and Pete. "We'll follow the trail as far as we can before it gets cold." They rode north across unfamiliar territory, following the increasingly faint signs of the stolen herd. The trail led through broken country, rocky draws and timber-covered ridges that would make perfect hiding places for men who didn't want to be found. "Patron," Miguel said after they'd ridden in silence for an hour. "There's something else about this I don't like." "What's that?" "The timing. Your new bride arrives and 3 weeks later we have trouble." Seems like quite a coincidence. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. The implication was clear, and it was one he'd been trying not to consider himself. Clara's arrival, her intimate knowledge of his routine, her years of watching from the shadows. Could she have been working with rustlers? Could her marriage proposal have been part of some elaborate scheme? That's a serious accusation, Miguel. I'm not accusing, just observing. You know I want you to be happy, but... Miguel paused, choosing his words carefully. She knows this ranch better than most of our own men. She's had 5 years to study our operations, our schedules, our weaknesses. Jed's mind raced through the past 3 weeks, searching for signs he might have missed. Clara's easy familiarity with the ranch layout, her casual knowledge of their neighbors and their business, the way she'd asked seemingly innocent questions about cattle movements and market schedules. But then he remembered her hands on his collar that morning, the gentle concern in her voice when she'd told him to be careful, the way she'd helped him pack away Sarah's belongings with such tenderness and respect, the quiet intimacy that had been growing between them each night as they lay beside each other in the darkness, sharing stories of their separate lives. No, he said finally, more to convince himself than Miguel. I don't believe it. I hope you're right, Patron, for all our sakes. They lost the trail at a rocky stream that would hide tracks and scent from any pursuing dogs. The rustlers had known exactly where they were going and how to cover their escape. As they turned back toward home, Jed couldn't shake Miguel's words or the seed of doubt they'd planted. The ride back passed in troubled silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful, but felt ominous instead. Clara met them at the barn, her face tight with concern. Any luck following the trail? Lost it at Willow Creek, Jed said, watching her face for any sign of relief or satisfaction, but all he saw was genuine disappointment and worry. Sheriff Morrison came by, she said. He's organizing a group of ranchers to patrol the area. Says there have been similar thefts over in Copper Falls and Devil's Canyon. The news should have been reassuring, proof that the rustling wasn't specifically targeted at the Cole Ranch, but Jed found himself analyzing every word, looking for hidden meanings that might not exist. Are you all right? Clara asked, moving closer. You look troubled. Just a long day, he said, but even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. That night, as they prepared for bed, Clara seemed to sense his distance. She sat at the vanity, Sarah's vanity, brushing her hair with slow, thoughtful strokes. Jedediah, she said without turning around, whatever Miguel said to you today about me, I hope you'll remember that doubt is a poison that can kill even the strongest foundation. The accuracy of her intuition startled him. How did you? Because I know Miguel is loyal to you, and I know what my sudden appearance must look like to a man charged with protecting your interests. She set down the brush and turned to face him. Ask me directly, and I'll answer directly. The invitation hung between them like a bridge he could choose to cross or burn. Looking at her face in the lamplight, open, honest, tinged with sadness that he would even need to ask, Jed made his choice. Did you have anything to do with those cattle being stolen? No, she said simply. I came here to build a life with you, not to destroy what you've built. But I understand why you have to ask. The words hung in the air between them like a verdict rendered. Clara's simple no carried the weight of absolute truth, and looking into her eyes, Jed felt the last of his suspicions crumble into ash. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by shame that he doubted her at all. I'm sorry, he said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. I should never have. Yes, you should have. Clara's voice was firm, but not unkind. You should question, you should protect yourself and your people. I would think less of you if you didn't. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. But now that you've asked, and I've answered, we don't speak of it again. Trust, once given, shouldn't require constant proof. The wisdom in her words struck him anew. How many people in his life possessed such clear understanding of human nature? Sarah had been kind and loving, but she'd never possessed this depth of insight into the complexities of the heart. "How did you become so wise?" he asked. A sad smile crossed her face. 20 years of watching people, Jedediah. 20 years of surviving on my own, learning to read intentions and motivations. When you have no one to rely on but yourself, you develop certain skills. You've been alone all this time. She turned from the window, and in the lamplight he could see the years of solitude written in the set of her shoulders. Not alone, exactly. I had my work, my students. But yes, alone in the ways that matter most. The admission opened a door he hadn't known existed. Since their wedding 3 weeks ago, they'd shared meals and conversations, even the intimacy of sleeping beside each other. But she'd revealed little about her life in the years since her father's death. Now, perhaps because of his doubt and her forgiveness of it, the walls were coming down. "Tell me," he said softly. "Tell me about those 20 years." Clara moved to the rocking chair by the window, the same chair where Sarah had sat during her final illness, and settled into it with the grace of someone who'd learned to make herself comfortable anywhere. "After my father died, I went to my aunt in Denver, my mother's sister. She was a spinster, a teacher, and she took me in more from duty than love." Clara's hands folded in her lap, and she spoke as if recounting someone else's story. "I was angry then, angry at God, angry at the world, angry at you. The anger was easier than the grief." Jed listened in silence, understanding that this was a gift, the first real glimpse into the woman who'd become his wife. "I finished my schooling and became a teacher myself. It seemed fitting, standing in front of a classroom trying to shape young minds, when my own life felt so shapeless and directionless." She paused, her gaze distant. "For 10 years, I taught and saved my money and planned my revenge. I was going to come back here with lawyers and newspapermen and destroy you publicly. What changed? I met a student, a boy named David whose father had been killed in a mining accident. Killed because the mine owner cut corners on safety to save money. David carried such rage, such poisonous anger, and I saw myself in him, saw what I was becoming." Clara's voice grew softer. "I realized that if I pursued revenge, I would become exactly the kind of person who values money and winning over human life. I would become you, or rather, who I thought you were." The observation cut deep, but it was accurate. "So you stopped planning revenge?" "I stopped feeding the anger. Instead, I started trying to understand what had really happened that night my father died. I hired my own investigators, tracked down the other men involved in the land deal, learned the truth about Harrison Caldwell and his schemes." Jed's breath caught. "You found Caldwell?" "I found what was left of him. He died in a prison in California, sentenced for fraud in another land swindle. Before he died, he confessed to forging my father's signature on those debt papers. His confession named you as an unwilling accomplice who tried to back out when you discovered the fraud." The words hit Jed like lightning. For 20 years, he'd carried the guilt of believing he'd been complicit in a deliberate swindle. To learn that his memory had been accurate, that he'd tried to stop it once he understood what was really happening, should have been liberating. Instead, it raised new questions. "You've known this for how long?" 5 years, ever since I started watching you." Clara leaned forward in the chair, her eyes intense. "That's when I knew you were worth saving, Jedediah. When I learned that the boy who'd made a terrible mistake had grown into a man who'd spent 20 years trying to atone for something he hadn't even done. The revelation recontextualized everything. Her decision to answer his advertisement, her willingness to marry him, her gentle insistence on sharing his bed and his life. She hadn't come seeking revenge or even simple companionship. She'd come seeking him specifically because she'd discovered the truth about his character. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why let me carry that guilt?" Because the guilt made you who you are, Clara said simply. A man who questions his own actions, who considers the consequences of his choices on others, who spent 20 years trying to be better than he was. If I'd simply arrived and absolved you, you might have become complacent, might have stopped trying to earn the forgiveness you thought you needed. The complexity of her reasoning left him speechless. She'd orchestrated not just their meeting, but his moral education, guiding him toward the kind of man she could respect and love. That's rather manipulative, he said, though not without admiration. Yes, it is. Clara's smile was rueful. I'm not perfect, Jedediah. I'm a woman who spent 20 years learning to survive by reading people and situations. Those skills don't simply disappear because I've decided to trust someone. And do you? Trust me? She stood and moved toward the bed, beginning to unpin her hair. I married you. I share your bed. I've told you things tonight I've never told another living soul. The dark strands fell around her shoulders as she looked at him directly. What do you think? But before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the yard below. Multiple horses riding hard. Jed moved quickly to the window and saw Miguel approaching with Sheriff Morrison and 2 other men, their faces grim in the moonlight. That's not good news, Clara observed, moving beside him at the window. They dressed quickly and went downstairs to meet the riders. Sheriff Morrison dismounted heavily, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something darker. Jed, Clara, sorry to bother you so late, but we found something you need to know about. Morrison pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. We caught up with one of the rustlers. Down near Devil's Canyon, he was carrying this. The paper was a hand-drawn map of the Cole Ranch, complete with detailed notations about patrol schedules, fence lines, and the locations of valuable breeding stock. At the bottom, in careful script, was written, "Payment as discussed. T.W." Jed felt the blood drain from his face. T.W. Thomas Whitmore. He looked at Clara, whose face had gone pale as moonlight. I know what you're thinking, she said quietly. But those aren't my father's initials, Jedediah. Thomas Whitmore has been dead for 20 years. Sheriff Morrison studied the map in the lamplight of the kitchen, his weathered face creased with concentration. The hand-drawn details were remarkably accurate. Every fence line, water source, and building precisely marked. Whoever had created this knew the Cole Ranch intimately. The rustler who had this, did he say anything about who gave it to him? Jed asked, though he dreaded the answer. Said a man approached him in Copper Falls 3 weeks ago, offered good money for a clean job on your ranch. Described the contact as well-dressed, educated, and he paid half up front. Morrison's eyes flicked between Jed and Clara. Said the man claimed to have a personal grudge against the Cole family. Clara sank into a chair, her face pale but determined. Sheriff, I need you to understand something. My father has been dead for 20 years. I saw his body, attended his burial. Whatever this is, it's not his doing. I believe you, ma'am, but someone wants us to think it is. Morrison folded the map carefully. Question is, who benefits from making it look like a dead man is seeking revenge? Miguel, who'd been silent since arriving, finally spoke up. Patron, there's something else. Something I didn't mention earlier because I wasn't sure it mattered. Jed turned to his foreman, noting the reluctance in the older man's voice. What is it? 3 weeks ago, just before Senora Cole arrived, I saw someone watching the ranch from the ridge above Miller's Creek. Thought it was just a drifter, maybe looking for work. But now you think it was reconnaissance, Jed finished. The timing was too convenient to ignore. Someone had been studying the ranch just before the rustling began, just before Clara's arrival. Clara stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the north pasture. There's something I need to tell you all, something I hoped I'd never have to reveal. Her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room go still. Clara? Jed moved toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. When I said I was alone for 20 years, that wasn't entirely true. She turned to face them, her dark eyes haunted. I have a brother. The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water. Jed felt the world shift around him, realigning into a configuration he hadn't imagined possible. Thomas Whitmore, Jr., Clara continued, her voice steady despite the obvious pain the admission cost her. He was 18 when our father died, old enough to disappear completely, young enough to nurse his rage without wisdom tempering it. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward. You mean to tell me Thomas Whitmore had a son? All these years, and no one mentioned a son. My father was protective of Tommy, kept him out of town mostly, worried that his difficulties would make him a target. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. Tommy was born with what my mother called a restless mind. He was brilliant, but unpredictable. Prone to fits of anger, obsessed with perceived slights. After our mother died, he became fixated on the idea that the world was conspiring against our family. Jed's mind raced back 20 years, trying to recall any mention of a son. But Thomas Whitmore had been a private man, and in the months leading up to his death, he'd become increasingly reclusive. A hidden son wasn't impossible, just carefully concealed. When our father died, Clara continued, Tommy disappeared that same night. I assumed he'd been overcome with grief, maybe wandered off and died in the wilderness. I searched for months, but found no trace. Eventually, I had to accept that I'd lost both my father and my brother in one terrible night. But now you think he survived, Morrison said. I think he's been surviving very well. Clara moved to the kitchen table and spread out the map. Look at the handwriting, the careful lettering, the precise measurements. Tommy was always meticulous about details when something interested him, and this, she pointed to the initials at the bottom. This is exactly the kind of dramatic gesture he would make, using our father's initials to frame his revenge. Miguel frowned. But Senora, if he's your brother, why would he target you too? You're both victims of what happened. Clara's laugh was bitter. Because in Tommy's mind, I'm a traitor. I married the enemy instead of seeking justice. I chose forgiveness over vengeance. She looked directly at Jed. To someone like my brother, that's the ultimate betrayal. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. A brilliant but unstable young man, nursing 20 years of rage, watching as his sister married the man he blamed for their father's death. It would be enough to push someone already on the edge into something darker. There's more, Clara said quietly. Tommy was always gifted with animals. He could gentle the wildest horse, train dogs to follow complex commands. If he's been living rough all these years, he'd know exactly how to move cattle without leaving obvious tracks. Sheriff Morrison stood, his expression grim. Mrs. Cole, I need you to think carefully. Where might your brother go? What places did he favor as a boy? There's a box canyon about 15 miles northeast of here, hidden in the timber above Willow Creek. My father used to take us there when we were children. Said it was the perfect place to hide, if trouble ever came looking. Tommy loved it there, called it his secret kingdom. Jed knew the place she meant. He'd found it years ago while tracking strays, a natural fortress with only one way in or out. If someone wanted to hide stolen cattle and plan their next move, it would be ideal. We'll need to organize a posse, Morrison said, but we'll have to be careful. If this man is as unstable as you say, he's dangerous, Clara interrupted. Not just unpredictable, but truly dangerous. 20 years of isolation and rage have probably made him worse, not better. She turned to Jed with eyes full of pain. I'm sorry, Jedediah. I should have told you about Tommy from the beginning. I hoped he was dead. Hoped I'd never have to face what he'd become. Jed moved to her side, taking her hands in his. They were cold as winter morning, trembling slightly with the weight of old secrets finally revealed. You couldn't have known he was alive? You couldn't have predicted this, but I could have warned you, could have told you that the Whitmore family had more ghosts than just our father." Clara's voice broke slightly. "Now your cattle are gone, your men are at risk, and it's all because of my family's poison spreading into your life." "Our life," Jed corrected firmly. "Our family now, and we'll face this together." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I hate to ask this, but if we find your brother, if we corner him, are you prepared for what might happen? He's committed serious crimes. Even if we take him alive, he's looking at years in prison, maybe worse." Clara straightened her shoulders, and Jed saw the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Sheriff, my brother died 20 years ago in the same tragedy that took my father. Whatever creature has been living in the wilderness since then, whatever he's become, isn't the boy I remember." She paused, then added more quietly, "Do what you have to do to protect innocent people. That's what Tommy would have wanted before the darkness took him." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rain before morning. It seemed fitting somehow, the weather matching the turbulence that had entered their lives. "We'll ride at first light," Morrison decided. "Jed, I'll want you and Miguel with me, plus 3 or 4 other good men." "Mrs. Cole, I'm coming with you," Clara said firmly. "Absolutely not," Jed said immediately. "It's too dangerous." Clara turned to face him, and her expression was implacable. "He's my brother, Jedediah. My responsibility, and I'm probably the only person who might be able to reach him if there's anything left of the boy I knew." She paused, then added more quietly, "Besides, if something goes wrong, if he's hurt or killed, I need to be there. I need to see it through." Looking at her face, Jed knew there would be no dissuading her. Clara had spent 20 years running from her family's tragic legacy. Now she was choosing to face it head-on, whatever the cost. "Then we all ride together," he said finally, "and we pray we're not too late to save him, or stop him." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingers drumming with impatience. Somewhere in the mountains, a man who should have been dead was planning his next move in a game of revenge that had already lasted 2 decades. The reckoning Clara had avoided for so long was finally at hand. Dawn came gray and subdued, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more rain before the day was through. Jed stood in the barn checking his rifle while Miguel saddled the horses, their movements efficient but tense. The air carried the electric feeling that comes before a storm, both meteorological and human. Clara emerged from the house dressed in men's clothing she'd borrowed from the bunkhouse, sturdy trousers, a wool shirt, and boots that would grip wet rock. She'd braided her hair tightly and secured it with leather cord, transforming herself from genteel schoolteacher to frontier woman with practiced ease. "You sure about this?" Jed asked, though he already knew her answer. The set of her jaw and the steadiness of her hands as she checked her own rifle told him everything he needed to know. "I've been sure about very little in my life, Jedediah. But this, facing Tommy, this is something I have to do." She met his eyes directly. "He's been shaped by 20 years of believing I abandoned him. If there's any chance of reaching him, of ending this without bloodshed, it has to come from me." Sheriff Morrison arrived with his deputies just as the first light began filtering through the clouds. Bob Caldwell and Jim Hansen were both seasoned lawmen who'd dealt with desperate men before, but Jed could see the wariness in their faces. Tracking a madman through treacherous mountain country wasn't a task any sane person approached lightly. "Mrs. Cole," Morrison said, tipping his hat. "I have to say again, I don't like the idea of you coming along. And I have to say again, Sheriff, that your opinion on the matter doesn't carry the weight of law." Clara's voice was polite but implacable. "I'm not under arrest, I'm not a minor, and I'm fully capable of making my own decisions about risk." Morrison sighed, but didn't argue further. He'd clearly learned that Clara possessed the kind of quiet determination that couldn't be budged by mere authority. The party of 6 rode out as the sun struggled to break through the overcast sky. They headed northeast toward the canyon Clara had described, following deer trails that wound through dense timber and over rocky ridges that offered numerous places for ambush. Jed found himself constantly scanning the tree line, his nerves stretched taut with anticipation. "Tell us more about this canyon," Morrison called to Clara as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "It's a box canyon, maybe 2 miles deep and half a mile wide at its mouth. The walls are sheer granite on 3 sides, and the only way in or out is through a narrow gap between 2 rock pillars. There's good grass and a year-round stream, which is why my father chose it as a hideout if we ever needed one." "Sounds like a perfect trap," Deputy Caldwell observed grimly. "For us, or for him," Clara agreed. "Tommy would know every rock, every tree, every hiding place in there. We'll be riding into his territory, playing by his rules." They paused at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold meal, huddling under the inadequate shelter of a grove of pines as the promised rain began to fall in earnest. The temperature was dropping, and Jed could see Clara shivering despite her borrowed coat. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly, offering her his coffee. "Constantly." Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "But not about coming along. About what we might find when we get there." "You mean your brother?" "I mean what's left of him." Clara stared into the dark liquid as if seeking answers in its depths. "The Tommy I remember was brilliant but fragile. Kind to animals, gentle with children, but prone to rages that could shake the whole house. 20 years of isolation." She shuddered. "I'm not sure we'll find anything human waiting for us." Miguel, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "Senora, sometimes isolation doesn't destroy a man. Sometimes it just concentrates what was already inside him." "That's what I'm afraid of," Clara admitted. They reached the mouth of the canyon as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. The entrance was just as Clara had described, a narrow gap between towering stone pillars that forced riders to proceed single file. Beyond the gap, the canyon opened into a hidden valley that seemed untouched by time. Sheriff Morrison called a halt and dismounted to study the ground. "Fresh tracks," he reported after a careful examination. "Multiple horses and cattle, too. Looks like our quarry is definitely here." "How recent?" Jed asked. "Hard to say with the rain, but I'd guess within the last day or 2. Morrison straightened and checked his rifle. "From here on, we assume we're being watched." They proceeded through the gap in single file, weapons ready and senses alert. The canyon walls rose around them like the sides of a cathedral, their surfaces carved and smoothed by millennia of wind and water. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the rock faces, making stealth impossible. The valley beyond was everything Clara had promised, a hidden paradise of green grass and clear water, surrounded by walls that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. But something felt wrong. The cattle were there. Jed could see the familiar brands of his stolen stock grazing peacefully near the stream. But there was no sign of human presence. "It's too quiet," Deputy Hanson muttered, voicing what they were all thinking. "Tommy was always good at hiding," Clara said, her voice tight with tension. "Even as a boy, he could vanish for hours and reappear where you least expected." They advanced slowly into the valley, spreading out in a loose line to avoid presenting a single target. The rain continued to fall, turning the grass slippery and reducing visibility as mist began to rise from the warmer ground. It was Miguel who spotted the cabin first, a rough structure built against the far wall of the canyon, so cunningly placed that it seemed to grow from the rock itself. Smoke rose from its chimney, a thin gray line that spoke of human habitation and careful fire management. "There," he said quietly, pointing. Sheriff Morrison raised his hand to halt their advance and studied the cabin through a small telescope. "I can see movement inside. Looks like one person, maybe two." He lowered the glass and turned to Clara. "Mrs. Cole, this is your last chance to reconsider. Once we get closer, there's no turning back." Clara straightened in her saddle, and Jed saw the same resolve that had carried her through 20 years of solitude and planning. "I understand, Sheriff, but I need to try talking to him first. If he sees a posse approaching, he might do something desperate." "Absolutely not," Jed said immediately. "I won't let you ride up there alone." "It's not your decision to make," Clara replied, but her voice was gentle. "Tommy won't hurt me, not immediately anyway. But strangers, men with guns, they'll trigger his worst instincts." Morrison considered this. "What do you propose?" "I ride up alone, try to establish communication, find out what he wants, whether there's any possibility of surrender. You stay here, ready to intervene if things go wrong." "And if they do go wrong?" Jed asked, though he dreaded the answer. Clara looked at him with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated wisdom and sorrow. "Then you do what you have to do to protect innocent people. That's what Tommy would have wanted before the darkness took him." The rain was falling harder now, turning the canyon floor muddy and treacherous. In the distance, thunder rumbled through the mountains like the voice of an angry god. Time was running short. The weather would make their retreat difficult, if not impossible, once full darkness fell. "I'll give you 15 minutes, Morrison decided. "If we don't hear from you by then, or if we hear gunshots, we're coming in." Clara nodded and urged her horse forward, riding alone toward the cabin and the confrontation she'd been avoiding for 20 years. Jed watched her go with his heart in his throat. This brave woman who'd entered his life like an answer to prayers he'd been afraid to voice. Behind them, the canyon entrance was already disappearing into mist and shadow. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their immediate survival, but the shape of the future they might or might not share together. In the distance, a figure emerged from the cabin, tall, lean, with the kind of stillness that spoke of a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Even at this distance, Jed could see the family resemblance in the way the man held himself, the tilt of his head as he watched Clara approach. Thomas Whitmore Jr. had been waiting 20 years for this moment. Now, as his sister rode toward him through the rain, the final act of a tragedy. 2 decades in the making was about to begin. Clara's horse picked its way carefully across the muddy valley floor while the rain drummed steadily against her hat brim. Each step brought her closer to the man she'd once known as her little brother, and further from any certainty about how this confrontation would end. The figure by the cabin remained motionless, watching her approach with the patience of a hunter who'd been tracking prey for 20 years. As she drew nearer, details became clear. Thomas Whitmore Jr. had grown tall and lean, his body hardened by decades of wilderness living. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, streaked with premature gray, and his clothes were a mixture of animal hides and worn fabric that spoke of complete self-sufficiency. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, the same deep brown she remembered, but now holding depths of rage and madness that made her stomach clench with fear. "Hello, Tommy," she called when she was still 50 yards away, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Clara." His voice was rougher than she remembered, gravelly from years of disuse. "I wondered when you'd finally come home." She urged her horse closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. This close, she could see the scars that marked his hands and face, testament to a life lived without the softening influence of civilization. A rifle rested casually in the crook of his arm, and she noticed his finger never strayed far from the trigger. "You've been watching me," she said. It wasn't a question. Tommy's smile held no warmth. "Watching you build a life while our father rotted in his grave. Watching you take the name of his killer. Watching you betray everything he died for. Tommy, Jedediah didn't what?" His voice cracked like a whip. "Didn't help them steal our land? Didn't profit from our father's death? Didn't build his fortune on our family's bones?" The rifle shifted slightly in his hands. "Or did you mean he didn't make you his whore?" The word hit like a slap, but Clara kept her voice steady. "He didn't know about the forged papers, Tommy. He was used, just like father was. When he realized what had really happened, he tried to stop it." "Lies." Tommy stepped closer to her horse, his eyes burning with 20 years of accumulated fury. "Pretty lies you tell yourself so you can sleep in his bed without drowning in shame. I have proof. Harrison Caldwell confessed before he died." "Caldwell's dead, and good riddance. But Cole is still alive, still prospering, still living on land that should have been ours." Tommy's hand tightened on the rifle. "Did you really think marrying him would protect him from justice?" Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment she'd prepared for, the conversation she'd rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. "What do you want, Tommy? What will it take to end this?" "End it." Tommy laughed, and the sound held no sanity. "Sister, this is just the beginning. The cattle were practice, a way to get your attention, to bring you home where you belong." "And where is that?" "Here, in the canyon where Father used to bring us. Where we were a family before the world destroyed everything good." Tommy's voice softened slightly, and for a moment Clara glimpsed the lost boy underneath the madman. "I built us a home, Clara. I saved the best of everything for when you came back. We can be a family again." The longing in his voice broke her heart. "Tommy, Father's been dead for 20 years. We can't go back." "We don't go back." The rage returned full force, transforming his face into something barely human. "We go forward. We take what's ours. We make them pay for what they did to us. And then what? We hide in this canyon forever. We live like outlaws until someone kills us or we kill each other. We live like Whitmores." Tommy raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at her, but making its presence unmistakable, with pride and honor and the knowledge that we avenged our father's memory. Clara looked into her brother's eyes and saw the truth that had taken her 20 years to accept. The boy she'd loved was truly gone, consumed by grief and rage and isolation. What stood before her was a dangerous stranger wearing her brother's face, driven by a mission that could never bring peace or closure. "I can't do that, Tommy," she said quietly. "I can't live for revenge. It would destroy everything good that Father taught us." "Then you're a coward and a traitor, just like I thought." Tommy's voice went flat and cold. "Just like our mother would have been if she'd lived to see what you became." The mention of their mother, gentle Eleanor, who died trying to birth a third child, sent pain lancing through Clara's chest, but it also brought clarity. Their mother had loved flowers and laughter, had believed in forgiveness and second chances. She would have wept to see what her son had become. Mother would have wanted us to heal, not destroy ourselves with hatred. Mother would have wanted justice. Tommy raised the rifle fully now, pointing it directly at her chest. "And if you won't help me get it, then you're just another obstacle to remove." Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm intensified, and Clara realized with crystal clarity that her childhood was about to die in this hidden valley, along with any hope of saving the brother she'd once adored. The rifle barrel gleamed wetly in the rain, steady as stone despite the wind that whipped through the canyon. Clara stared into her brother's eyes and saw her own death reflected there, not the quick, merciful end she might have hoped for, but something prolonged and terrible, designed to punish her for what Tommy saw as 20 years of betrayal. "You have 10 seconds to change your mind," Tommy said, his voice eerily calm. 10 seconds to choose family over the man who destroyed us." Clara's horse shifted nervously beneath her, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, Jed and the others, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious threat. They would arrive too late to save her, but perhaps in time to stop Tommy before he could escape to kill again. 5 seconds, Tommy said. I choose family, Clara said quietly, and saw triumph flash in her brother's eyes. But not the family you're offering. I choose the family I've built with Jedediah, based on love and forgiveness instead of hatred and revenge. Tommy's finger tightened on the trigger. Then you choose to die with him. The gunshot split the air like thunder, but it wasn't Tommy's rifle that fired. From behind, Clara came the crack of a Winchester, and Tommy spun sideways as the bullet struck his shoulder, sending his own shot wild into the canyon wall. He stumbled but didn't fall, and when he looked up, his eyes held the flat, calculating look of a predator reassessing its situation. Jed rode up beside Clara, his rifle still smoking from the shot that had saved her life. Behind him came Sheriff Morrison and the deputies, spreading out to prevent Tommy's escape. The wounded man backed toward his cabin, cradling his injured arm, but still dangerous. "Thomas Whitmore, Jr.," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of the law. "You're under arrest for cattle rustling and conspiracy to commit murder. Drop your weapon and surrender peacefully." Tommy's laugh was wild and broken. "Peacefully? There's been no peace for 20 years, Sheriff. Not since they murdered my father and stole everything that was ours." "Your father died of a broken heart," Jed said, his voice cutting through the rain. "But he wasn't murdered. He was cheated, yes, but by men who used me as much as they used him." "Lies." Tommy raised his rifle with his good arm, swinging it toward Jed. "Pretty lies to make yourself feel better about building your fortune on our graves." But before he could fire, Clara spurred her horse forward, placing herself between Tommy and Jed. "Stop, Tommy, please. This isn't what Father would have wanted." "Father's dead," Tommy screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "They killed him just as surely as if they'd put a bullet in his brain, and now you're protecting his murderer." "I'm protecting my husband," Clara said with quiet dignity. "A good man who spent 20 years trying to atone for a mistake he made as a foolish boy. A man who's honored Father's memory better than you ever have with your hatred and violence." The words hit Tommy like physical blows, his face contorted with rage and pain, and for a moment, Clara thought he might simply collapse under the weight of emotions too large for any human heart to contain. Instead, he backed further toward the cabin, his rifle sweeping in wild arcs that kept the lawmen at bay. "You want to protect him, then you can die with him, both of you together, the way it should have been 20 years ago." He reached the cabin door and kicked it open, revealing the dark interior beyond. Clara caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze. Barrels and boxes that could only contain explosives, enough to bring down half the canyon wall and bury them all under tons of rock and earth. "Tommy, no!" she screamed, but her brother was already moving, his madness now complete and purposeful. "If I can't have justice," Tommy shouted over the thunder, "then I'll have revenge. The whole world can burn before I let you forget what you've done." He disappeared into the cabin, and Clara knew with terrible certainty that they had only moments before he triggered whatever trap he'd prepared. The narrow canyon entrance that had seemed like such perfect cover now revealed itself as the death trap it truly was. No escape, no shelter, nowhere to run when the explosions began. "Everyone out!" Sheriff Morrison yelled, wheeling his horse toward the canyon mouth. "Move, now!" But even as they spurred their horses toward the gap in the rocks, Clara knew they wouldn't make it in time. Tommy had planned this moment for 20 years, and he wouldn't let them escape to carry word of his failure to the outside world. The first explosion came just as they reached the midpoint of the canyon, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Behind them, the cabin disappeared in a ball of fire and smoke, and the ancient rock walls began their long, inevitable collapse into the valley below. Thunder crashed overhead as heaven and earth seemed to merge in one final, terrible crescendo of sound and fury, and Clara closed her eyes and prayed for a forgiveness that might come too late for all of them. The narrow gap between the stone pillars had never seemed so far away as it did with the canyon collapsing behind them. Clara bent low over her horse's neck, feeling the animal's powerful muscles strain as they raced against falling rock and the thunder of Tommy's final, terrible vengeance. Beside her, Jed rode with the desperate grace of a man who'd found something worth living for just in time to face losing it. Sheriff Morrison reached the gap first, his horse leaping through just as a massive boulder crashed into the space where he'd been a heartbeat before. The deputies followed, their mounts foam-flecked and wild-eyed, with terror. Miguel's horse stumbled on the loose stone but recovered, carrying its rider to safety with seconds to spare. Clara and Jed brought up the rear, their horses running side by side as if they'd been born to race together. The gap was so close now, 50 yards, 30, 20, but behind them, the very earth seemed to be coming apart. The sound was indescribable. Not just the crash of falling stone, but the death scream of a place that had stood unchanged for millennia. They burst through the gap together just as the canyon entrance collapsed completely, sealing Tommy's tomb with the finality of geological time. The shock wave knocked them from their horses, sending them rolling across wet grass, while the ground bucked and heaved beneath them like a living thing. When the earth finally stilled, an eerie quiet settled over the mountainside. The rain had stopped, and through the breaking clouds, the first tentative rays of evening sunlight painted the devastation in shades of gold and amber. Where the canyon entrance had been, only a wall of jumbled stone remained, as if nature had decided to erase that hidden valley from the world entirely. Clara pulled herself to her feet, her body aching from the fall, but her heart aching more from the loss she couldn't quite process. Tommy was gone, truly gone this time, and with him had died the last connection to the family she'd been born into. The little brother who'd once caught fireflies with her in summer evenings was buried under tons of rock, along with the man he'd become. Jed limped to her side, his left arm hanging awkwardly where he'd landed hard on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "No more than I was before," Clara replied, and they both understood she wasn't talking about physical injuries. Sheriff Morrison approached them, his face grim but relieved. "Mrs. Cole, I'm sorry about your brother. I know that couldn't have been easy." Clara looked back at the blocked canyon where her father's cattle were now trapped but alive, along with whatever remained of Tommy's dreams and delusions. He made his choice 20 years ago when he let hatred consume everything good inside him. I wish I could have saved him." "Some people can't be saved," Miguel observed quietly. "They choose the darkness because it feels safer than the light." As they gathered their scattered horses and began the long ride home, Clara found herself thinking about choices and consequences, about the different paths that grief could carve through a human heart. Tommy had chosen revenge and isolation, feeding his pain until it became his entire identity. She had chosen differently. First anger, then understanding, then forgiveness, and finally love. The ride back to the ranch passed in thoughtful silence, each of them processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. By the time they reached the familiar gates of the Cole Ranch, full darkness had fallen, but warm light spilled from the windows of the house, welcoming them home. Inside, Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast that none of them had appetite for, but they went through the motions of eating while Sheriff Morrison filled out his report, and the deputies planned their return to town. Eventually, the lawmen departed, leaving Clara and Jed alone with the echoes of the day's violence and the uncertain promise of tomorrow. "What happens now?" Clara asked as they stood together on the front porch, looking out over land that had seen too much tragedy for one lifetime. "Now we live," Jed said simply. "We build something good from all this wreckage. We honor the dead by choosing life." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "The cattle, they're still trapped in the canyon. We'll find another way in. Might take months, maybe years, but we'll get them out." Jed's arm tightened around her. "Your father's dream of that land supporting 1,000 head. We'll make it happen. Just not the way any of us expected." 3 months later, Clara stood in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Glory Bend, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered from the meadow where her father had once planned to build his house. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only the words Thomas Whitmore, Jr., lost son, found peace. They'd never recovered his body from the collapsed canyon, but Clara had insisted on a marker anyway. Tommy deserved to be remembered for who he'd been before the darkness took him, not just for what he'd become in the end. Jed approached quietly, carrying his own flowers for Sarah's grave nearby. They'd established this routine, Sunday visits to honor their respective dead, together but allowing each other the privacy of grief. "Any regrets?" he asked as they walked back toward town together. Clara considered the question seriously. "About Tommy, about us, about the path that brought us here." She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "No. Sadness, yes. Grief for what might have been. But no regrets. We've built something real from the ashes of old mistakes." "And what have we built?" Clara smiled and took his hand, their wedding rings catching the afternoon sunlight. "A second chance. For both of us. And maybe—" She paused, thinking of the possibility that had been growing in her mind for weeks now. Maybe a family that can heal instead of harm. They walked down the hill toward home, toward the life they'd chosen together despite everything that had tried to tear them apart. Behind them, the wind moved through the cemetery grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of seasons yet to come. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and serene, holding their secrets close while the valley below continued its ancient cycle of death and rebirth, loss and discovery, endings that became beginnings when viewed through the lens of time. The end.